let's finally get into the Java. So I've got a few examples here, and I'm going to start with this one right here. We're actually not going to do display authors. I'm going to get rid of that right now. This does come from that Deitel book, and then these are some sort of modifications, extensions from this initial example. But we're going to keep it simple with this very first example. I'm going to open that up now by double-clicking on it. My Java files are set to automatically open in Notepad++. This is what my Notepad looks like. Under Settings, Style Configurator, I use the deep black. I like a high contrast, dark background for my coding. And so that's just what I use. That's just my settings. I also enable global font size and increase the font size because I like it big and easy to read. Is import some necessary code for use with our SQL database. So these are the imports that were included with the example here from the book. They initialize some private static final string variables for the database name and the username and the password. These have to match up with what was written in that connect command, right? This was our database name, this was username, this was password. And then in public static void main, we've got a big old try catch here. And this I had initially not seen before looking through these examples. This is what's known as a try with resources. You'll notice after the word try, there are parentheses, not the starting curly brackets, but parentheses. And the way this works is any classes that implement the auto-closable interface can be instantiated inside this set of parentheses, and they will be automatically closed when the try catch is finished. So for example, we create this variable named RowSet of type JDBC RowSet, which implements auto-closable. And this is essentially identical to if we had simply declared it inside the curly brackets. And then also, scrolling down to the very, very bottom of this try catch, we will go through that code. It's as if we had written a finally with rowset.close at the bottom. It's as if we had done that. It's simply a way for programmers to not forget that they need to close their resources. So by instantiating this variable inside of the parentheses of the try, it will automatically be closed at the end. Technically, you don't need to include a semicolon, but I don't like that. I don't like inconsistency, so I would just reformat that ever so slightly to maybe look like this. There are very few places in Java where a semicolon is optional, so I'm just going to include it. I think that's a better way to write it. All right, so JDBC RowSet is this class that's going to interact with our database for us. It's going to let us run queries. Let's see how to set it up. All right, so we tell it what is the database URL, what's the name of the database, what's the username, what's the password. And then we can ask the RowSet to set a command. What's a query we want to run against the database? And they give this example query here. It's a select statement. We're going to select everything from the authors table. Notice they capitalize authors, which was not done in the books.sql file, but it doesn't matter because SQL is case insensitive. It does not care about capitalization. And they're going to select everything from the authors table where the last name column begins with D. And they're going to put it in order by first name ascending. There's lots of details and extras you can do with SQL. I'm going to maybe talk about that in a separate video, but for now we're just going to kind of move past it. Finally, we actually want to execute that query on the RowSet. Now at that point, our query is executed. The RowSet contains the results of our query. We just need to access it. So there's a very common set of steps that we're going to follow as I scroll down here to get that data out. We're going to create a result set metadata type variable by asking the RowSet to get its metadata. And then we're going to ask that for an integer, what is the number of columns in the query results that we just asked for? We'll print out a little header. And furthermore, we'll loop through and print out the column names. A very confusing aspect of SQL. What's weird about this for loop? Well, we start at 1 instead of the more traditional starting at 0, and we also loop up to include the number of columns greater than or equal to, not just, less than or equal to, not just less than. That's a little non-typical, but I believe the rationale is that SQL is designed for use by people who might not directly consider themselves programmers, people who are more like sort of business or business administration. So for them, it might seem more typical to start your numbers at 1 rather than us programmers who start our numbers at 0. So us programmers, we're just going to have to get used to it. MATLAB, for example, does the same thing, because for the same reason, I believe, it's meant for a more general audience than people who would consider themselves programmers. All right, so we're going to loop through the number of columns, starting at 1, including the number of columns. And we simply call this method right here, metadata.getColumnName. Sorry, it scrolled off the screen. Let me adjust that slightly. Metadata.getColumnName parentheses I. It's going to return a string at position I for what is the name of that column. And this is where you're going to get access to, at least for that author's query. I'm going to briefly go up to books.sql. You're going to get the word author ID, the word first name, the word last name. That's what we're accessing with this method right here. All right, so this loop just prints out those column names on the first row, scrolling on down. Now we're going to display out our data. It's nested loops. The outer loop is a while loop, calling this RowSet.next method. It's similar in some respects to scanner.next. It's progressing the RowSet object through the SQL results, the results of our query. It's progressing by rows, so each time next is called, RowSet progresses to the next row result of our query until there's no more left, at which point it will return, I believe, null, not false, but while we'll treat null as false, and then that loop will finish, will exit. The inner for loop is going to loop over the data from our query. Let me rearrange the indentation here slightly. So it's going to loop through each separate column in each row of our data, and it is again looping from 1 to the number of columns. In fact, this for loop header right here, if I scroll up slightly, you will see is exactly the same as the for loop header from displaying the columns. So those are exactly the same. This time, instead of asking the metadata for the column names, we're asking the RowSet to get object at position I. And this object's toString method will automatically be called, and it will be displayed as a string. There are other gets. You can get string, you can get int, you can get many other types as well. But for our purposes of just displaying out data, we don't know what the specific data might be. We're just going to call getObject and display it out. And that's pretty much it. Finally, at that point, we close out the try with catching any potential SQL exceptions that might be thrown. It's always useful to print out a stack trace if you catch some sort of exception, and then we'll just exit because at that point something went wrong and we don't know how to recover from it. So we'll just print the stack trace and exit. Let's actually execute JDBC RowSet test. So I'm going to go ahead and compile. And run it, and something went wrong. So if you get this error message, no suitable driver found, you need to run setembeddedcp.bat. Or what I would like to do is actually set those variables, class path and module path, so that we don't have to run it every single time. All right, so let's open up my environment variables, and let's see if this works. Edit the system environment variables. And then in the bottom here, under system variables, we'll click new, give a variable name. I'm going to copy over the class path. Okay, and then I'm going to copy over its value. Paste that in under variable value, press OK. I'm going to add another new one, copy over module path, copy over its value into the variable value. Okay, and then press OK. Okay. Now, my command prompt, I do not believe will work right away. If I just try and run that Java code, nope, it will not. I got to close the command prompt and open up a new one. So close that one out, open up a new command prompt, zoom in, just, make it easy to read, large font size, and then change directory cd into that folder. Just drag and drop it over, hit enter. And let's try again. Let's try to run JDBC RowSet test, and now it works. All right. So I don't need to run set embedded CP every single time if I change my path variables to include basically those paths that set embedded CPU runs itself. And there's the results of my query. All the data from the authors table of authors whose last names begin with D, alphabetized by first name, Abby, Harvey, Paul. And that is because, going back to our Java code, scrolling up toward the top, the query that they chose to type in selected all, selected star from authors where the last name begins with D and order by first name ascending. Fantastic. Let's look at another Java example. All right, so that was JDBC RowSet test. Now this is a modification of that. That's why it's named JDBC RowSet test extended, which I wrote. Well, I modified based on the book's code. And I just modified it for a little bit of organization. That's what you're going to see. I'm going to progressively move this closer to an object-oriented and a more general interactivity with our database. So the only difference in terms of the imports is that I'm also importing a scanner to interact with the user. The instance variables are the same database, same username and password. Scrolling on down. In my try here, inside the parentheses of the try, before we even get to the curly brackets, there are two different variables that are being instantiated, not just the JDBC RowSet, which is the same as last time, but also a scanner, because a scanner is also auto-closable. So again, the use of this, which I was unfamiliar with until I looked at some of these examples, the use of this is so that we, the programmer, do not forget to close these off at the end. It's equivalent to just declaring these inside the curly brackets and then remembering, as we scroll down to the very bottom, remembering to also have a finally where the RowSet and the scanner are closed. But this can be an easy thing to forget, so we don't have to remember to include this. We just put them, so now I'm deleting it, scrolling back up to the top, we just put their declarations, their instantiations, inside the parentheses up here so that they will be automatically closed. Inside the try-catch, it's pretty much the same as before, except I have added a do-while loop. So I'm connecting RowSet to the database, I've got a temporary string variable, and then I've got a do-while loop here. I'm going to ask the user, would you like to enter a custom query? We don't have to rely on what's already typed into the code. We can type in our own SQL query. Now, if the user does not type in anything at all, their answer is blank, well then we're going to run a default query. In fact, we're going to run the exact same query from that example I just saw, and we're going to do it by calling this display query method, which takes the JDBC RowSet object as input, followed by a string of the query to be run. Now, otherwise, if the user does type in some sort of query, we'll just call display query with whatever they typed in, and otherwise the inputs are the same. Then we'll wrap up our do while loop. Would you like to continue? They'll say Y for yes or N for no, and then that'll wrap up our do while loop. Catch any SQL exceptions that may have occurred, and that's the end of main. Now below that, we have the display query method, which is essentially all I've changed compared to the previous example, but I think this adds some nice flexibility, and it adds some organization. We have moved the part of the code that runs a query against the database into a nice self-contained, relatively self-contained method. It does throw a SQL exception, so that try-catch from above is necessary to catch the resulting SQL exception. And then the code inside sets the command to Q here, which is the string input for the query, executes it, and then runs the exact same code as before. Because you can look at the details of this by pausing the video, I'm going to move through it relatively quickly. We get the metadata, get how many columns there are, loop through, print all the column names, scrolling down, loop through every row of results, and print every value within the row. And then that's it. Below that is literally the copyright information from the book. I felt that it was important to include that since it's very much based on the book example. But we've organized it into this nice method right here. And I'm going to run this code and just give you a little demo of it. You can probably already anticipate most of what it does. And then we're going to move on to another example that is even more object-oriented. All right, enter a query. Now, if I enter nothing, I just hit enter. That's going to run that query, same query from before. Now, would you like to continue? I'll say yes. Maybe I want to enter a different query. Maybe I want to select just the title from the titles database. So I'll hit enter. And now we can see all the different titles from that database. Would you like to continue? One mistake that I often make is that I will try to do a select command, and I will forget that I'm not supposed to put a semicolon at the end. That will cause an error, and it will look like this. So let's see, exception in thread main, null pointer exception. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure I could catch this exception and handle it, but that's a hard one for me. I always think I need a semicolon, but you actually don't. Not within the Java code part of the query. When you're running the queries from the Derby command prompt, you do need to type them in with a semicolon. All right, let's wrap up the last example here for this video. So the last two files, JDBC RowSet wrap test and RowSet wrapper. And again, these are my modifications of the book example. I think I'm going to run it first, and then we'll see what it does. I'm going to go ahead and compile all javac space star.java to compile all the Java files in the folder. And then I'll run JDBC RowSet wrap test. All right, enter a query. So similar to before. What if I don't? What if I just hit enter? All right, it'll run that standard query. I say yes, enter a query. I'm going to do the same one as before. Please note that the capitalization does not matter. Oops, but it does matter if you type in, what column you are trying to select from. Select title from titles. I'm just trying to be very random with my capitalization. And this will work. The capitalization does not matter. All right, and there we go. We get them all. So it does the exact same thing as the previous example. In what way is this better? Well, I think it's better because it's more object-oriented. We've got two classes, JDBC RowSet wrap test. That's the class that contains main. It only has one import, just the scanner. It's just going to worry about user interaction. Very little database stuff here. The database stuff is going to be wrapped into the RowSet wrapper class, which I wrote, and we'll look at that in a moment. I've named the variable DB interface because that's pretty much what it is. It's our database interface. Create a scanner, temporary string variable. Here's my do while loop. Because I have organized so much code into a separate class, the do while loop fits on one screen, at least with this font size it does, which I think is nice. Prompt the user, get their response. If their response is blank, run that default query that we've decided upon. This is similar to the code I showed you just moments ago. But instead of just calling display query as a static method, this is now a method that belongs to the DB interface, which is of type RowSet wrapper. So the RowSet wrapper has a public method named display query. It doesn't need to take the RowSet anymore as input because it's got its own private instance variable for that RowSet. Otherwise, we're going to pass in the user's custom query and then, ask them if they would like to continue querying further, continue with the do while loop, or simply say goodbye and close. Now, I am calling close explicitly rather than in the parentheses of the try or in a finally at the end of a try catch. And that's perfectly fine as well. All right, let's look at the RowSet wrapper. So here's RowSet wrapper. This is going to take care of all our database needs. So we have those database imports at the top. We've got a private JDBC RowSet type variable that's instantiated to null right here. So not really instantiated at all, but set equal to null. In the constructor for our RowSet wrapper, I just chose to make the database name and username and password local variables as opposed to private static final instance variables. I think this is a reasonable choice, but it is a little bit just a choice, a stylistic choice. Here's the try catch, still inside of the constructor. Notice I did not declare the RowSet inside of parentheses of the try. I did not choose to do that for a very important reason. We don't want this thing to close when this try catch is finished. we want the RowSet to persist for the life of the RowSet wrapper object, because otherwise we won't be able to run the other methods. We won't be able to query the database. So I actually don't want to declare it in that fashion. So I declare the variable inside, I keep saying declare. I initialize the variable inside of the curly brackets of the try catch. I make sure it's connected to the database with the correct username and password, and I catch any exceptions that may occur. Great, so after the constructor, our instance variable should be instantiated, should be connected to the database. We should be ready to go. Here is the display query method. Very, very similar to what I had before. Set the command, set the query that was given, execute it, get the metadata, display the column names, display the values from each of the rows that are resulting from our query, catch any resulting exceptions, and that's it. That's the whole method. Finally, I do have a close method at the bottom so that I can close off the RowSet, and because this does throw a SQL exception, we're going to need to put that in a try catch. And that's the end. That's the end of that class. So very few changes compared to the previous, but I think this is a nice stepping stone, a building block for further methods that we can add in to query the database, perhaps to insert data into the database or update or change data. We've not actually seen any examples of those. I'm going to save those for a future video. All right, so hopefully you saw some information about how to interact with, at least how to query, a SQL database using Java, using the JDBC RowSet.